Steve Jobs died in October of 2011. Most people assumed the magic died with him. They were wrong. Jobs was a visionary, a genius, one of the greatest business minds in American history. And he wasn't even the best CEO Apple ever had. As the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs created the first all-in-one home computer designed with the average household, school, or novice user in mind. He championed a graphic user interface, now the standard for every digital interaction, from laptops to smart thermostats. Under his leadership, Apple became the undisputed smartphone market leader. Jobs became known for his ability to push a second-mover advantage, once believed impossible, often coming to markets years after competitors, but with better hardware and superior user experiences, wrestling buyers away from competitors that were first but vulnerable to Apple's replacement strategy. It's hard to imagine a more successful CEO, visionary, and technologist than Steve Jobs. Having started the company in his parents' garage and growing it into an international consumer technology juggernaut, his resume speaks for itself. But I would argue he wasn't the greatest Apple CEO. In August of 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple. By October of that same year, he lost his long battle with pancreatic cancer at the age of 56. Maybe not since Thomas Edison was a company more intrinsically linked to its founder than Apple was to Jobs. At least once a year, Jobs would pack out an auditorium wearing his signature jeans and black mock turtleneck and talk about exciting and sometimes revolutionary new products from Apple. He was a master storyteller, setting up the main characters of the story, the eventual product users, the antagonists, usually some technological limitation or constraint, and then suddenly reveal the hero product destined to save the day. The crowd would cheer, the press would swoon, and Apple's share price would increase. Under his tenure, he introduced the Apple II, the iMac, iPod, iPad, MacBook, and the company's signature product, the iPhone. Steve Jobs was Apple, and Apple was Jobs. He built markets from whole cloth for Apple, and Apple made him one of the most successful and wealthy business leaders in history. As Jobs fought tooth and nail to beat the almost guaranteed mortality of a pancreatic cancer diagnosis, he handed operational control over to Tim Cook. On the day of Jobs' resignation, the board approved the appointment of Cook as the new CEO. Largely unknown to the general public, Cook had been with Apple since 1998, when he was hired as the senior vice president of worldwide operations, recruited by Jobs himself. By 2005, he was promoted to the COO of Apple, and throughout Jobs' medical leave, Cook served as his proxy under the radar and with no fanfare. When Cook was named as Jobs' successor, the market responded with, "Who?" Between 2011 and 2026, Tim Cook established himself as the greatest tech CEO ever, even greater than Steve Jobs. Now, I'm sure some people are running to the comment section to tell me how big a moron I am. Stick with me here for a few minutes and I'll explain what I mean. You know, one of the best ways to support small YouTube channels like mine is to subscribe. If you like the content and you'd like to see more of it, consider subscribing. Back to the episode. Steve Jobs helped build Apple into a company with a market value of $350 billion, from zero to $350 billion. Tim Cook took the company from $350 billion to $3.65 trillion. With Cook at the helm, Apple introduced the iPhone X, iPad mini, Apple Watch, and arguably the most successful product in Apple's history since the iPhone, the Apple AirPods. There was at least one incredibly important product innovation during Cook's tenure that often gets overlooked: the M-series chips, which combine the functions of GPUs and CPUs. This chipset has become the standard bearer for every OpenClaw developer running AI agents on Mac minis, all powered by M chips. But where Jobs was known for bringing cutting-edge consumer hardware to market, Cook's leadership should probably be memorialized by the more than $100 billion in annual revenue created by Apple service products. Those services include the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, and Apple TV. Now representing more than 25% of Apple's annual revenue, services produce a recurring, highly profitable revenue stream. After Cook took the CEO role, Apple's total annual revenue grew from $108 billion to $416 billion. Net income from $26 billion to $112 billion plus, and a market cap that grew from $350 billion to $4 trillion, which represents a stock price increase of 20 times. While Jobs was held in godlike esteem for his very public triumphs, Cook quietly did the boring and highly profitable work of increasing efficiency, simplifying supply chains and logistics, all of which contributed to incredible growth in profit margins. Cook led his teams to create world-class global manufacturing, reducing labor costs, and drove just-in-time inventory management principles, which reduced Apple's standing inventory from months to weeks. In 2025, Apple Services products reached a profit margin of 75%, up from 55% in 2017. Being the greatest CEO of all time doesn't mean he was perfect. Apple spent 10 years trying to develop the Apple Car and eventually abandoned it after they couldn't make the business case to continue pursuing it. Apple Vision Pro, by all objective measures, was a flop, a brilliant piece of technology that served no practical purpose and made many users motion sick after 20 minutes of use. I'd stipulate this would never have launched with Jobs still around. And we can't forget the tragic introduction of Apple Maps. From satellite imagery that showed a melting Brooklyn Bridge to directions leading people to businesses that had been closed for 20 years, to map guidance that urged users to drive through fields or off bridges, Cook ended up apologizing to the public while encouraging them to use competitors' products until Apple could get Maps functional. Critics of Cook would often refer to him as a, quote, logistics CEO, pointing to less innovative products. Apple products did get incrementally better, but lacked the holy shit reaction of an Apple II or iPhone. Now, he wasn't avoiding risk in his pursuit of those simplified logistics and lower costs. Cook doubled down on Chinese manufacturing, opting to rely on Foxconn to manufacture up to 95% of all iPhones made worldwide. That partnership came with accusations of unfair labor practices, specifically inhuman amounts of overtime, poor worker safety, and low pay. Foxconn's management was blamed in the past for a slew of worker suicides in its Shenzhen facility, and as recently as 2025, Foxconn was accused of violating wage pay schedules, safety protocols, and engaging in ethnic discrimination. As the Trump presidency started, tariffs on Chinese exports became a priority for the administration, and Apple now faced huge regulatory risk and rising importation costs associated with their Chinese manufactured products. Apple also appeared to pretty much ignore the explosion of AI products over the last 3 years, and when they did attempt to get into the game, Apple botched the launch of Apple Intelligence, leading to a chorus of boos from the market that eventually subsided into yawns. Then there was the trophy Cook presented to President Trump. Okay, in fairness, it wasn't actually a trophy, but many felt it was the metaphorical equivalent and emblematic of Cook's willingness to placate President Trump. From attending the inauguration and personally donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration committee to attending the premiere of the First Lady's movie, Melania, critics, Apple employees, and consumers were outraged by what they saw as presidential bootlicking, adoration that seemed to ignore the president's anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ, and nationalist agenda. But just like betting on services over product, Cook ran the political calculus. Take the PR hit and backlash from Apple customers for cozying up to the administration, receive crucial tariff protections, and increase shareholder value. The perceived ass-kissing hated by so many created an exemption from the 100% semiconductor tariff on imported chips, established a tariff exemption on iPhones manufactured in India and China, and avoided nearly $1.1 billion in additional quarterly costs on various Apple computer and chip products. Just as Apple's effective manufacturing and importation costs should have exploded due to the sweeping tariffs, Cook's calculus resulted in a roughly 6% increase in Apple's market capitalization. Now that Trump's tariffs by executive order have been deemed illegal by the Supreme Court, one might believe Cook didn't need to do any of this, that ultimately the tariffs would have ended anyway. But between the time Apple was granted its exemptions and the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs was 10 months. CNBC estimated Apple saved between $2.6 and $3.6 billion in tariffs during that time. Look, I cringed too. I wish none of that happened. I would have preferred a boycott and a strong public rebuke of the president's grift, but I also own Apple stock, and Cook's job is to preserve and increase shareholder value. It's what's expected, first and foremost, from a public company CEO. Call it gross or the personification of capitalistic greed if you want, but he preserved and increased value for shareholders. He did his job. While seemingly boring and unremarkable, Tim Cook was anything but. Under his watch, Apple became the first publicly traded company to reach a total market cap of $1 trillion, doubling to $2 trillion exactly 2 years and 17 days later. Apple had a $4 trillion market cap the day Cook announced his retirement. I can certainly appreciate the argument that if Jobs hadn't accomplished what he had, Cook would never have had the opportunity to do what he did, that without Jobs, Apple wouldn't exist. Jobs was by far the most important CEO in Apple's history, but he wasn't the company's best CEO. Jobs wasn't capable of what Cook accomplished, not because he couldn't figure it out, but because he didn't want to. Jobs famously said, quote, "We're here to put a dent in the universe, otherwise why even be here?" Optimizing supply chains and vendor agreements was never going to, in his mind, create that dent. It was pedestrian, a distraction, something for others to figure out for him. Cook will seldom be considered a product-forward innovator like Jobs. He wasn't obsessed with every curve, shape, button, and user experience of Apple products. That's not the CEO he was. He drove efficiency and profitability. He increased the price of an iPhone by 400%, and Apple still sold more than 2.8 billion units during his tenure, roughly 190 million per year. He took a company with an aging product lineup that was fighting for relevance as competitors started catching up technologically, all while charging 20 to 50% less than Apple for similar products. He changed the culture of a company that had been built to reflect its mercurial founder and did the thankless work of reducing costs, simplifying the business operations, creating greater margins, launching services that generate more than $100 billion per year, and position the company for a successfully unremarkable transition to new leadership. Few, if any, Fortune 500 CEOs can claim the same level of success as Tim Cook. So what do you think? Was he the greatest CEO of all time? If not him, who would you put in his place? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this episode. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.